KaraokeBooks.
Family Happiness. Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Louise Maude, Aylmer Maude. Audiobook. Chapter 6. Days, weeks, 2 whole months of seclusion in the country slipped by unnoticed, as we thought then, and yet those 2 months comprised feelings, emotions, and happiness, sufficient for a lifetime. Our plans for the regulation of our life in the country were not carried out at all in the way that we expected, but the reality was not inferior to our ideal. There was none of that hard work, performance of duty, self-sacrifice, and life for others, which I had pictured to myself before our marriage. There was, on the contrary, merely a selfish feeling of love for one another, a wish to be loved, a constant causeless gaiety and entire oblivion of all the world. It is true that my husband sometimes went to his study to work, or drove to town on business, or walked about attending to the management of the estate, but I saw what it cost him to tear himself away from me. He confessed later that every occupation, in my absence, seemed to him mere nonsense in which it was impossible to take any interest. It was just the same with me. If I read, or played the piano, or passed my time with his mother, or taught in the school, I did so only because each of these occupations was connected with him and won his approval. But whenever the thought of him was not associated with any duty, my hands fell by my sides, and it seemed to me absurd to think that anything existed apart from him. Perhaps it was a wrong and selfish feeling, but it gave me happiness and lifted me high above all the world. He alone existed on earth for me, and I considered him the best and most faultless man in the world, so that I could not live for anything else than for him, and my one object was to realize his conception of me. And in his eyes I was the first and most excellent woman in the world, the possessor of all possible virtues, and I strove to be that woman in the opinion of the first and best of men. He came to my room one day while I was praying. I looked round at him and went on with my prayers. Not wishing to interrupt me, he sat down at a table and opened a book. But I thought he was looking at me and looked round myself. He smiled, I laughed, and had to stop my prayers. "Have you prayed already?" I asked. "Yes." "But you go, I'll go away." "You do say your prayers, I hope?" He made no answer and was about to leave the room when I stopped him. "Darling, for my sake, please repeat the prayers with me." He stood up beside me, dropped his arms awkwardly, and began, with a serious face and some hesitation. Occasionally he turned towards me, seeking signs of approval and aid in my face. When he came to an end, I laughed and embraced him. "I feel just as if I were 10. "And you do it all," he said, blushing and kissing my hands. Our house was one of those old-fashioned country houses in which several generations have passed their lives together under one roof, respecting and loving one another. It was all redolent of good sound family traditions, which as soon as I entered it seemed to become mine too. The management of the household was carried on by Tatiana Semyonovna, my mother-in-law, on old-fashioned lines. Of grace and beauty there was not much, but, from the servants down to the furniture and food, there was abundance of everything, and a general cleanliness, solidity, and order, which inspired respect. The drawing-room furniture was arranged symmetrically, there were portraits on the walls, and the floor was covered with homemade carpets and mats. In the morning room there was an old piano, with chiffoniers of 2 different patterns, sofas, and little carved tables with bronze ornaments. My sitting room, specially arranged by Tatiana Semyonovna, contained the best furniture in the house, of many styles and periods, including an old pier glass, which I was frightened to look into at first, but came to value as an old friend. Though Tatiana Semyonovna's voice was never heard, the whole household went like a clock. The number of servants was far too large, they all wore soft boots with no heels, because Tatiana Semyonovna had an intense dislike for stamping heels and creaking soles, but they all seemed proud of their calling, trembled before their old mistress, treated my husband and me with an affectionate air of patronage, and performed their duties, to all appearance, with extreme satisfaction. Every Saturday the floors were scoured and the carpets beaten without fail. On the first of every month there was a religious service in the house and holy water was sprinkled, on Tatiana Semyonovna's name day and on her son's, and on mine too. Beginning from that autumn, an entertainment was regularly provided for the whole neighborhood. And all this had gone on without a break ever since the beginning of Tatiana Semyonovna's life. My husband took no part in the household management, he attended only to the farm work and the laborers, and gave much time to this. Even in winter he got up so early that I often woke to find him gone. He generally came back for early tea, which we drank alone together, and at that time, when the worries and vexations of the farm were over, he was almost always in that state of high spirits which we called wild ecstasy. I often made him tell me what he had been doing in the morning, and he gave such absurd accounts that we both laughed till we cried. Sometimes I insisted on a serious account, and he gave it, restraining a smile. I watched his eyes and moving lips and took nothing in. The sight of him and the sound of his voice was pleasure enough. "Well, what have I been saying?" "Repeat it," he would sometimes say. But I could repeat nothing. It seemed so absurd that he should talk to me of any other subject than ourselves. As if it mattered in the least what went on in the world outside. It was at a much later time that I began to some extent to understand and take an interest in his occupations. Tatiana Semyonovna never appeared before dinner, she breakfasted alone and said good morning to us by deputy. In our exclusive little world of frantic happiness a voice formed the staid orderly region in which she dwelt was quite startling. I often lost self-control and could only laugh without speaking, when the maid stood before me with folded hands and made her formal report. The mistress bade me inquire how you slept after your walk yesterday evening, and about her I was to report that she had pain in her side all night, and a stupid dog barked in the village and kept her awake. And also I was to ask how you liked the bread this morning, and to tell you that it was not Teres who baked today, but Nikolashka who was trying his hand for the first time, and she says his baking is not at all bad, especially the cracknessel. But the tea rusks were overbaked. Before dinner we saw little of each other, he wrote or went out again while I played the piano or read, but at 4 o'clock we all met in the drawing-room before dinner. Tatiana Semyonovna sailed out of her own room, and certain poor and pious maiden ladies, of whom there were always 2 or 3 living in the house, made their appearance also. Every day without fail my husband by old habit offered his arm to his mother, to take her in to dinner, but she insisted that I should take the other, so that every day, without fail, we stuck in the doors and got in each other's way. She also presided at dinner, where the conversation, if rather solemn, was polite and sensible. The commonplace talk between my husband and me was a pleasant interruption to the formality of those entertainments. Sometimes there were squabbles between mother and son and they bantered one another, and I especially enjoyed the scenes, because they were the best proof of the strong and tender love which united the two. After dinner Tatiana Semyonovna went to the parlor, where she sat in an armchair and ground her snuff or cut the leaves of new books, while we read aloud or went off to the piano in the morning room. We read much together at this time, but music was our favorite and best enjoyment, always evoking fresh chords in our hearts and as it were revealing each afresh to the other. While I played his favorite pieces, he sat on a distant sofa where I could hardly see him. He was ashamed to betray the impression produced on him by the music, but often, when he was not expecting it, I rose from the piano, went up to him, and tried to detect on his face signs of emotion, the unnatural brightness and moistness of the eyes, which he tried in vain to conceal. Tatiana Semyonovna, though she often wanted to take a look at us there, was also anxious to put no constraint upon us. So she always passed through the room with an air of indifference and a pretense of being busy, but I knew that she had no real reason for going to her room and returning so soon. In the evening I poured out tea in the large drawing room, and all the household met again. This solemn ceremony of distributing cups and glasses before the solemnly shining samovar made me nervous for a long time. I felt myself still unworthy of such a distinction, too young and frivolous to turn the tap of such a big samovar, to put glasses on Nikita's salver, saying, "For Peter Ivanovitch," "For Marya Minikna," to ask, "Is it sweet enough?" and to leave out limps of sugar for nurse and other deserving persons. Capital. Capital. Just like a grown-up person, was a frequent comment from my husband, which only increased my confusion. After tea Tatiana Semyonovna played patience or listened to Marya Minikna telling fortunes by the cards. Then she kissed us both and signed us with the cross, and we went off to our own rooms. But we generally sat up together till midnight, and that was our best and pleasantest time. He told me stories of his past life, we made plans and sometimes even talked philosophy, but we tried always to speak low, for fear we should be heard upstairs and reported to Tatiana Semyonovna, who insisted on our going to bed early. Sometimes we grew hungry, and then we stole off to the pantry, secured a cold supper by the good offices of Nikita, and ate it in my sitting room by the light of one candle. He and I lived like strangers in that big old house, where the uncompromising spirit of the past and of Tatiana Semyonovna ruled supreme. Not she only, but the servants, the old ladies, the furniture, even the pictures, inspired me with respect and a little alarm, and made me feel that he and I were a little out of place in that house and must always be very careful and cautious in our doings. Thinking it over now, I see that many things, the pressure of that unvarying routine, and that crowd of idle and inquisitive servants, were uncomfortable and oppressive, but at the time that very constraint made our love for one another still keener. Not I only, but he also, never grumbled openly at anything, on the contrary he shut his eyes to what was amiss. Dmitri Sidorov, one of the footmen, was a great smoker, and regularly every day, when we two were in the morning room after dinner, he went to my husband's study to take tobacco from the jar, and it was a sight to see Sergei Mikhailich creeping on tiptoe to me with a face between delight and terror, and a wink and a warning forefinger, while he pointed at Dmitri Sidorov, who was quite unconscious of being watched. Then, when Dmitri Sidorov had gone away without having seen us, in his joy that all had passed off successfully, he declared, as he did on every other occasion, that I was a darling, and kissed me. At times his calm connivance and apparent indifference to everything annoyed me, and I took it for weakness, never noticing that I acted in the same way myself. It's like a child who dares not show his will, I thought. My dear, he said once when I told him that his weakness surprised me, how can a man, as happy as I am, be dissatisfied with anything? Better to give way myself than to put compulsion on others, of that I have long been convinced. There is no condition in which one cannot be happy, but our life is such bliss. I simply cannot be angry, to me now nothing seems bad, but only pitiful and amusing. Above all, l'amour est l'ennemi du bien. Will you believe it, when I hear a ring at the bell, or receive a letter, or even wake up in the morning, I'm frightened. Life must go on, something may change, and nothing can be better than the present. I believed him but did not understand him. I was happy, but I took that as a matter of course, the invariable experience of people in our position, and believed that there was somewhere, I knew not where, a different happiness, not greater but different. So 2 months went by and winter came with its cold and snow, and, in spite of his company, I began to feel lonely, that life was repeating itself, that there was nothing new either in him or in myself, and that we were merely going back to what had been before. He began to give more time to business which kept him away from me, and my old feeling returned, that there was a special department of his mind into which he was unwilling to admit me. His unbroken calmness provoked me. I loved him as much as ever and was as happy as ever in his love, but my love, instead of increasing, stood still, and another new and disquieting sensation began to creep into my heart. To love him was not enough for me after the happiness I had felt in falling in love. I wanted movement and not a calm course of existence. I wanted excitement and danger and the chance to sacrifice myself for my love. I felt in myself a superabundance of energy which found no outlet in our quiet life. I had fits of depression which I was ashamed of and tried to conceal from him, and fits of excessive tenderness and high spirits which alarmed him. He realized my state of mind before I did, and proposed a visit to Petersburg, but I begged him to give this up and not to change our manner of life or spoil our happiness. Happy indeed I was, but I was tormented by the thought that this happiness cost me no effort and no sacrifice, though I was even painfully conscious of my power to fact both. I loved him and saw that I was all in all to him, but I wanted everyone to see our love. I wanted to love him in spite of obstacles. My mind, and even my senses, were fully occupied, but there was another feeling of youth and craving for movement, which found no satisfaction in our quiet life. What made him say that, whenever I liked, we could go to town? Had he not said so, I might have realized that my uncomfortable feelings were my own fault and dangerous nonsense, and that the sacrifice I desired was there before me, in the task of overcoming these feelings. I was haunted by the thought that I could escape from depression by a mere change from the country, and at the same time I felt ashamed and sorry to tear him away, out of selfish motives, from all he cared for. So time went on, the snow grew deeper, and there we remained together, all alone and just the same as before, while outside I knew there was noise and glitter and excitement, and hosts of people suffering or rejoicing without one thought of us and our remote existence. I suffered most from the feeling that custom was daily petrifying our lives into one fixed shape, that our minds were losing their freedom and becoming enslaved to the steady passionless course of time. The morning always found us cheerful, we were polite at dinner, and affectionate in the evening. It is all right, I thought, to do good to others and lead upright lives, as he says, but there is time for that later. And there are other things, for which the time is now or never. I wanted, not what I had got, but a life of struggle. I wanted feeling to be the guide of life, and not life to guide feeling. If only I could go with him to the edge of a precipice and say, one step, and I shall fall over, one movement, and I shall be lost. Then, pale with fear, he would catch me in his strong arms and hold me over the edge till my blood froze, and then carry me off whither he pleased. This state of feeling even affected my health, and I began to suffer from nerves. One morning I was worse than usual. He had come back from the estate office out of sorts, which was a rare thing with him. I noticed it at once and asked what was the matter. He would not tell me and said it was of no importance. I found out afterwards that the police inspector, out of spite against my husband, was summoning our peasants, making illegal demands on them, and using threats to them. My husband could not swallow this at once. He could not feel it merely pitiful and amusing. He was provoked, and therefore unwilling to speak of it to me. But it seemed to me that he did not wish to speak to about it because he considered me a mere child, incapable of understanding his concerns. I turned from him and said no more. I then told the servant to ask Maria Minikna, who was staying in the house, to join us at breakfast. I ate my breakfast very fast and took her to the morning room where I began to talk loudly to her about some trifle which did not interest me in the least. He walked about the room, glancing at us from time to time. This made me more and more inclined to talk and even to laugh. All that I said myself, and all that Maria Minikna said, seemed to me laughable. Without a word to me he went off to his study and shut the door behind him. When I ceased to hear him, all my high spirits vanished at once. Indeed, Maria Minikna was surprised and asked what was the matter. I sat down on a sofa without answering, and felt ready to cry. What has he got on his mind? I wondered. Some trifle which he thinks important, but if he tried to tell it me, I should soon show him it was mere nonsense. But he must needs think that I won't understand, must humiliate me by his majestic composure, and always be in the right as against me. But I too am in the right when I find things tiresome and trivial, I reflected, and I do well to want an active life rather than to stagnate in one spot and feel life flowing past me. I want to move forward, to have some new experience every day and every hour, whereas he wants to stand still and to keep me standing beside him. And how easy it would be for him to gratify me. He need not take me to town, he need only be like me and not put compulsion on himself and regulate his feelings, but live simply. That is the advice he gives me, but he is not simple himself. That is what is the matter. I felt the tears rising and knew that I was irritated with him. My irritation frightened me, and I went to his study. He was sitting at the table, writing. Hearing my step, he looked up for a moment and then went on writing. He seemed calm and unconcerned. His look vexed me. Instead of going up to him, I stood beside his writing table, opened a book, and began to look at it. He broke off his writing again and looked at me. "Masha, are you out of sorts?" he asked. I replied with a cold look, as much as to say, "You are very polite, but what is the use of asking?" He shook his head and smiled with a tender timid air, but his smile, for the first time, drew no answering smile from me. "What happened to you today?" I asked. "Why did you not tell me?" "Nothing much, a trifling nuisance," he said. "But I might tell you now. 2 of our serfs went off to the town." But I would not let him go on. "Why would you not tell me when I asked you at breakfast?" I was angry then and should have said something foolish. I wished to know then. "Why? Why do you suppose that I can never help you in anything?" "Not help me," he said, dropping his pen. "Why, I believe that without you I could not live. You not only help me in everything I do, but you do it yourself." "You are very wide of the mark," he said, and laughed. "My life depends on you. I am pleased with things, only because you are there, because I need you." "Yes, I know, I am a delightful child who must be humored and kept quiet," I said in a voice that astonished him, so that he looked up as if this was a new experience. "But I don't want to be quiet and calm. That is more in your line, and too much in your line," I added. "Well," he began quickly, interrupting me and evidently afraid to let me continue, "when I tell you the facts, I should like to know your opinion." "I don't want to hear them now," I answered. I did want to hear the story, but I found it so pleasant to break down his composure. "I don't want to play at life," I said, "but to live, as you do yourself." His face, which reflected every feeling so quickly and so vividly, now expressed pain and intense attention. "I want to share your life, too." But I could not go on, his face showed such deep distress. He was silent for a moment. "But what part of my life do you not share?" he asked. "Is it because I, and not you, have to bother with the inspector and with tipsy laborers?" "That's not the only thing," I said. "For God's sake try to understand me, my dear," he cried. I know that excitement is always painful, I have learnt that from the experience of life. I love you, and I can't but wish to save you from excitement. My life consists of my love for you, so you should not make life impossible for me. You are always in the right, I said without looking at him. I was vexed again by his calmness and coolness while I was conscious of annoyance and some feeling akin to penitence. Masha, what is the matter? He asked. The question is not, which of us is in the right, not at all, but rather, what grievance have you against me? Take time before you answer, and tell me all that is in your mind. You are dissatisfied with me, and you are, no doubt, right, but let me understand what I have done wrong. But how could I put my feeling into words? That he understood me at once, that I again stood before him like a child, that I could do nothing without his understanding and foreseeing it all, this only increased my agitation. I have no complaint to make of you, I said, I am merely bored and want not to be bored. But you say that it can't be helped, and, as always, you are right. I looked at him as I spoke. I had gained my object. His calmness had disappeared, and I read fear and pain in his face. Masha, he began in a low troubled voice, this is no mere trifle. The happiness of our lives is at stake. Please hear me out without answering. Why do you wish to torment me? But I interrupted him. Oh, I know you will turn out to be right. Words are useless, of course you are right. I spoke coldly, as if some evil spirit were speaking with my voice. If you only knew what you are doing, he said, and his voice shook. I burst out crying and felt relieved. He sat down beside me and said nothing. I felt sorry for him, ashamed of myself, and annoyed at what I had done. I avoided looking at him. I felt that any look from him at that moment must express severity or perplexity. At last I looked up and saw his eyes. They were fixed on me with a tender, gentle expression that seemed to ask for pardon. I caught his hand and said, "Forgive me. I don't know myself what I have been saying. But I do, and you spoke the truth." "What do you mean?" I asked. "That we must go to Petersburg," he said, "there is nothing for us to do here just now." "As you please," I said. He took me in his arms and kissed me. "You must forgive me," he said, "for I am to blame." That evening I played to him for a long time, while he walked about the room. He had a habit of muttering to himself, and when I asked him what he was muttering, he always thought for a moment and then told me exactly what it was. It was generally verse, and sometimes mere nonsense, but I could always judge of his mood by it. When I asked him now, he stood still, thought an instant, and then repeated 2 lines from Lermontov. He is his madness prays for storms, and dreams that storms will bring him peace. He is really more than human, I thought, he knows everything. How can one help loving him? I got up, took his arm, and began to walk up and down with him, trying to keep step. "Well?" he asked, smiling and looking at me. "All right," I whispered. And then a sudden fit of merriment came over us both. Our eyes laughed, we took longer and longer steps, and rose higher and higher on tiptoe. Prancing in this manner, to the profound dissatisfaction of the butler and astonishment of my mother-in-law, who was playing patience in the parlor, we proceeded through the house till we reached the dining room. There we stopped, looked at one another, and burst out laughing. A fortnight later, before Christmas, we were in Petersburg.
If you liked what you heard, please subscribe to the channel.